The state of the Indian economy is getting grimmer by the day. Not every SME and MSME, medium and small company, can jump back after a 3-week shutdown and no revenues. Many more will die if the economy were locked down for 6 weeks and then 8 weeks. Large companies are ordering furloughs or what you call leave without pay. Big hiring machines like infotech companies have ordered a hiring freeze, while marquee companies like Asian Paints, some Tata Group companies are asking their vendors for more suppliers credit. That is, we will not pay you for 30 days, 60 days. Now, as companies lose profits and their people lose salaries, governments will lose taxes. So how can the government design a revival package, much less meet medical emergencies from a thinner treasury? And what more can the Reserve Bank do besides the rate cuts and the loan moratoriums that it has already announced? I have with me one of India's premier economists and central bankers, Dr. Rakesh Mohan. He was the go-to person for successive governments since almost 1995, I think. He has been chief economic advisor, deputy governor at the Reserve Bank, India's, in fact, South Asia's executive director at the IMF, and more recently, he decided how much reserves the Reserve Bank ought to hold. Dr. Mohan, thank you very much for joining me today. Well, let me start with something minor, actually. The Reserve Bank has broken an agreement, the monetary policy agreement. It is the MPC which must decide rates, but without involving the MPC, the Reserve Bank has moved the operating rate from repo to reverse repo and cut the reverse repo, actually without involving the MPC. You think it is kosher to do these almost unlawful things?
I'm certainly very surprised that the Reserve Bank has done this because, to my understanding, it is constrained by the legislation. It is not an administrative order setting up the Monetary Policy Committee. So I'm very surprised that they've done this. And second, that presumably it would have been easy enough to convene the MPC, of course, on a remote basis, and make such a decision. So that is certainly very surprising. I have to admit, of course, that I have never been a votary of the inflation targeting and MPC framework. Okay. But once you have instituted that and have legislation to enforce it, then it is, I think, regrettable that the RBI decided to do this. I don't know, of course, what went behind the reasoning to do it.
Okay. All right. Well, there's something else that the Reserve Bank has done, which you can maybe question in terms of the law. And I am referring to the fact that it almost definitely bid in a primary auction. The last government auction, the Reserve Bank appears to have put in some bids with some banks or primary dealers. I mean, do you think that that is kosher? Because the FRBM Act says that the Reserve Bank shall not buy in a primary auction.
Well, I don't know the details or facts behind this. So if it is the case that they have done something back-to-back with primary dealers, it would perhaps not violate the letter of the law. Given that in any case, it is doing large open market operations, that could just be a variation of that. So, as I said, I don't know the detail of that. So, it's difficult for me to comment more precisely on this. However, I think that what would be more advisable is that this is the time to invoke the escape clause that's in the FRBM, which was inserted, I think, 2 years ago, to enable the RBI to participate in primary auctions. But the modalities of that would be somewhat complicated and they would have to be worked on. But I do think that I certainly would have no issue at all with the RBI participating in primary auctions, but with appropriate transparency, appropriate announcements, and appropriate modalities. So in that, on a substantive sense, I don't have much of a problem with it, but I think that the formalities, etc., have to be maintained, and so that this does not constitute a precedent, and also that it is done in a very, very prudent manner, and provides confidence to the markets as well as the citizens in general.
Okay. Actually, that was going to be my next question to you. This direct monetization, directly buying bonds from the government, the Reserve Bank has not done that since 2002. And you were witness more than anyone else to the ad hoc treasury bills, the way in which the government would merrily ask the Reserve Bank to monetize its deficit up until the mid-90s. You're okay with the RBI doing it now?
Well, I think the best way of answering this, perhaps, is to quote the IMF managing director. I heard an interview yesterday where she describes the current crisis as a totally global crisis, which is completely unprecedented. She said, never before in living memory has there been such a combined pandemic and economic crisis together on a global scale. Now I'm adding the so-called global financial crisis was actually a North Atlantic financial crisis. This is my words, not hers. Just as there was an Asian financial crisis in the 1990s. So this crisis is of a much larger scale. The global economy, again I'm quoting the IMF managing director, the global economy is on life support. And what does life support mean? It does mean across many countries in the world, that the central banks are giving life support to the government and to the respective countries. Hence, in her words, I'm quoting, we must spend as much as we can and a little more. And she further went on to say, there's great uncertainty, both on the economic side as well as the medical side, with respect to the virus developments that may occur. So I would say that this is a real black swan event in which every country has to do, I would say, whatever it takes, in the case of India, whatever it takes to do what is necessary. Of course, we have to be careful because we don't have the advantages that a country like the US has or other European countries. But nonetheless, we have to do whatever it takes to do what is necessary. So I feel that our strategy has to be twofold. We have to do whatever is possible to protect people first from the virus and provide treatment as feasible, regardless of income levels. Two, I would feel that make sure that the food supply chain works as well as it can in the circumstances, and make sure there's availability of food, especially for the poor, who've been rendered jobless by the nationwide lockdown. And three, in terms of priority, we also have to make sure that companies, small, medium, and large, are protected from falling towards bankruptcy. And this is essential to protect the financial sector also from the kind of cascading that could take place as a consequence of losses. So the upshot of all this is there's probably no alternative to permitting the direct financing of the government by the RBI as necessary. And so in some sense, if we don't use the escape clause and therefore be in such an unprecedented crisis, when would we use it?
Well, actually, to be fair, the Reserve Bank has allowed a lot of WMA, the Ways and Means advances to the government. Yesterday, it raised the limit to 2 lakh crore for the central government, and for the states, it has so far raised it to almost 52,000 crore. The limit last year, that is the year ended March 31, was 32,000 crore. So a substantial 60% increase in the WMA loans for both centre and states. It has done that, even if it has not directly bought debt. But Dr. Mohan, let me come to the fiscal side. The fiscal situation is also pretty bad. How bad is it in your estimate? Because taxes are going to fall. Some people are estimating by about 1% of GDP, maybe 2 lakh crore. What's your estimate of how bad it can get for the fisc?
Quite frankly, I can't have a quantitative estimate. I can only make qualitative comments. Yes, of course, the fisc will be affected very significantly. First, the GST, obviously, that since the nation has been in lockdown for a little over 3 weeks and certainly until May 3, although some relaxations must be happening since yesterday. But obviously, the GST will take a big knock. Second, presumably, the direct taxes will take a big knock. Income tax, personal income tax, as well as corporate income tax. Third, even though customs duties no longer form a large proportion of our revenues, but given the global trade slowdown and our own import slowdown, that will make a huge impact. The only silver lining, of course, is the heavy reduction in oil price levels. So there's obviously, as you said, going to be a major revenue shortfall. And if it's 1% of GDP, that wouldn't surprise me at all. On the expenditure side, one would have to presumably some of the particularly capital expenditures of the government must have slowed down. Having said that, however, as and when the lockdown is lifted, it would be very important for the government to restart those capital expenditures as fast as possible, both for the sake of the growth of the economy, but also to get as much employment going, particularly in construction works, as fast as possible. And of course, all the additional expenditures that I've talked about, whether it is to do with food supply, whether it is to do with support of companies for small, medium, and large. And I think that what would be important is to really figure out ways and means of doing this support, maybe through different kinds of guarantees, to minimize the fiscal loss. But nonetheless, to my mind, there's no question that in addition to what the deficit was going to be anyway, which different estimates place at 7 to 8% of GDP, state and central governments combined, there could be, the expenditures could be as much as another 5% of GDP.
Okay. So you're okay even if it goes to about 13% of GDP, even above 10%?
Well, I mean, I can't say okay, but the question is, what's the choice?
Okay.
That if we don't do these things, you will have to pay a much larger bill later.
Okay.
That if it is the case that companies fail, their large-scale bankruptcies, that cascade, which then affect the banking system, finally the bill will come to the government, just like the NPA bills have been coming to the government in terms of recapitalization of banks.
No, but Dr. Mohan, should we also worry about other actors in the international scene like rating agencies? I mean, just a couple of days back, Indonesia has been not downgraded, but the outlook has been brought to negative. But then Indonesia is one notch above the investment grade. We are just about making the cut to investment grade. Would we not have to worry if we went into double-digit deficit?
Given the global nature of this unprecedented crisis which I referred to, I feel that the credit rating agencies should be the first ones to be put under lockdown globally.
Okay.
Okay, so I think that's the first point, and I mean that seriously, almost actually.
Okay.
But more seriously, just look at what's happening around. Just take the United States. Of course, they have the advantage of the dollar, but the United States has already announced a fiscal relief program. It's not stimulus; it's relief program of around 10% of GDP, and which is certainly to go up much higher. There's another bill in Congress of about $450 billion in addition to the $2 trillion, and this is on top of an expected deficit prior to the virus of around 5% of GDP. So the likelihood is that the U.S. fiscal deficit for this year will be more than 15% of GDP. As I said, of course, the U.S. has special advantages, so we don't have the privilege of doing everything that they can. So in that sense, I think that, and also the U.S. GDP ratio will go beyond 100%. And that's happening across the world. So I wouldn't worry about the credit rating agencies. As I said, they should be locked up and not told to go home. And second, I think we are fortunate as far as the rating agency impact is concerned, that we are fortunate, and this is policy that many of us have strongly advocated for over the years, of not subjecting India to foreign investment substantively in government bonds. And so there isn't the kind of impact that a credit rating downgrade does to us as it does to other countries. Of course, it will impact the debt ratings and the costs that the companies with private sector will have to bear if after the crisis they do go into foreign markets. But I don't think that this is an issue at all that should worry us now. And quite frankly, I've checked on this with friends here in the US, No one is looking at what the credit rating agency is doing around the world.
Okay, all right. That's a big relief that, at least that one big control over deficit financing will not be such a problem at this juncture. Dr. Mohan, do stay on for just a minute. We have to take a break, but we're coming back in a jiffy and continuing this discussion. Welcome back to this very special of Indianomics. We have with us one of the best economists of the country for the past 3 decades and economic policymaker, Dr. Rakesh Mohan. Dr. Mohan, from your perch in the United States, you would be better able to tell us about the global economy and from your years of policy making. The global economy, we understand from IMF estimates, is going into a contraction. It's a minus 3% for the current year. How does that impact India? I mean, considering that we are supposed to be a more internal-facing economy.
Well, I think, Latha, that I would say that we have been consistently underestimating our exposure to the world. We are no longer as closed as people think, and even we think. We just have to look at the numbers in terms of our trade GDP ratio, and including the service sector. So I haven't yet seen the numbers to do with estimates of a global trade slowdown, but very clearly there's going to be a major decline in global trade, at least for 2020, and maybe for some time to come, as so many supply chains will indeed be disrupted, and the issues to do with China. So the IMF estimate for contraction for 2020 for the global economy is minus 3%. That is, the global GDP will be down by around 3% for 2020, according to the IMF. They are, of course, as always, being optimistic about a very quick upturn of 5.8% in 2021. So both in terms of the domestic disruptions, of course, we don't know yet how the lockdown will be lifted, when it will be lifted, what will be the phasing. It'll have to be done very carefully. But nonetheless, of course, there will be a somewhat lasting impact of the lockdown that we've had to do. So I think that we do have to brace for clearly a recession in 2020, and depending how the lockdown is lifted, how the economy comes back into action, how global trade comes back into action, we have to be somewhat cautious in our expectation of a liftoff after the lockdown gets lifted.
Okay. We have not seen a recession. Even in 2008-9, it was, I think, a 3% growth. We have not seen a contraction, sir. Not since I started reporting in 1995. What do you think? You think we can bounce back? You're talking of a recession this year for India. Do you think we can bounce back, or can entities, MSMEs, die and, simply not be able to re-emerge the next year?
Yeah, this, I think, of course, is a very serious issue. Once again, since I'm perched in the US, let me just talk a little bit about what's happened in the US to get an idea of what kind of damage we might have. Now, the US, of course, is their per capita income is 25 times plus ours. Most of the US is in the organized sector. Yet, what is so shocking here is that within just last month or so, 4 weeks or so, the total filings for unemployment insurance has gone up to about 22 million people.
Yes.
22 million.
Yes.
And that's 13.5% of the labor force. And that excludes, of course, people who've not been able to file for unemployment insurance. Again, going back to the 2008-9 North Atlantic financial crisis, that the maximum then was about 600,000 people filing for unemployment. So it's a massive hit on the US economy. In our case, we don't have the data. One can just imagine, with the large proportion of the economy being in the informal sector, with the large number of people who've been rendered jobless, small companies, whether it's Kirana stores or others, don't have the staying power to keep paying their employees. So there must be large-scale distress, first of all, among among employees. And second, the kind of losses that these enterprises must be making. Further, what I would say is that the Indian lockdown so far is much more stringent than anywhere else.
That's right.
So in the United States, for example, trains are running, airlines are running, buses are running, of course, at very, very low reduced schedules. So my point of all this is that we must have a major impact of what has happened, something that once again the world has not seen, and nor have we. So we have to do everything possible to understand what's going on and take strong and quick measures to protect both people and enterprises of all sizes.
Okay. You know, there is a growing argument here that perhaps the government has dug itself into a hole in terms of, protecting lives over livelihood too much. And now the cost of livelihood could be so high that probably the pendulum has to swing. Do you think that, would you go with that argument, that it's about time we concentrated more on livelihood and kept May 3rd as a hard date when we actually start allowing people to come out?
Yes, I'm more in favor of the lifting of the lockdown earlier rather than later. Having said that, the government would have to be guided by their assessment of the health threat. Now, what is true, of course, is that the actual number of declared cases and deaths in India are really very small relative to the size of the country.
Yep.
My favorite statistic on that is that the number of cases in India and the deaths is roughly the same as that of the state of Connecticut, where I live in the United States.
Okay.
So, okay. But the question is, one, whether they understated. Two, whether we have succeeded because of the lockdown in keeping those numbers low. And then three, that what would happen if the virus really goes off in terms of huge infections in the country? Because we have very little to protect ourselves with.
Yeah.
So it would have to be a very graded response. I'm glad, of course, that some graded opening has started yesterday. And there is an expectation of a larger opening on May 3rd. I do feel that the transportation should be opened up, perhaps on a graded scale, so that commerce can start moving. So we don't have the luxury of the kind of fiscal package that United States, Germany, Japan, and others have done. Yet we have to do whatever it takes to do what is necessary. But at the same time, I think that we do have to be more much more keen to start opening the lockdown, because we don't have the luxury of doing the kind of fiscal action that has been taken elsewhere.
Oh, yes. There seems to be a strong medical opinion that developing herd immunity is better than lockdowns. But anyway, I think we should have a different kind of specialist to make that, to carry on that kind of debate. But I'm running out of time, sir. I wanted to ask you one more international question or economic policy question. You know, the Indian government has quietly tweaked the border country rules and changed them in such a way that Chinese companies cannot take over, Chinese entities can't take over Indian companies, taking advantage of distressed valuations. You think that's smart tweaking, or do you think we shouldn't go down that path?
Frankly, I'm surprised by this.
Oh.
But of course, I'm not familiar with the specific provocation that has led to this policy announcement and the urgency of doing this during these troubled times.
Okay.
Having said that, if I can provide a general comment, which is that given what is happening to the global economy, where the damage to the Western countries, that is the United States, all Western European countries, is much larger than what we're observing for the Asian countries, number one. Number two, even prior to the COVID crisis, the projections for the global economy in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years was that Asia will have a larger and larger weight in the global economy over the next couple of decades, and of course, especially China. So whereas we obviously have to do whatever we need to do in terms of any negative thing that China could possibly do to us or their companies, but at the same time, if we want a revival after the lockdown, after the COVID crisis, then we have to be much more geared to the East and including China.
Okay.
Furthermore, if we want manufacturing to move from China to us, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen if we close our borders to Chinese investment.
Okay.
Remember that foreign direct investment in China did not come from the United States or the West. It came from overseas Chinese.
Yeah.
And so if we have an ambition, which we ought to take advantage of this crisis and have activities moving to us from China, then this is the wrong thing to do.
Oh, unfortunately, I made this last question. I should have made it the first question, but this calls for another discussion with you. Unfortunately, we have to postpone that for another day. Dr. Mohan, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Very important takeaways from someone who has made policy for India in various positions for the last 30 years, that RBI should not hesitate about primary monetization of deficit, that is buying government bonds directly, as well a package that the government must think of very quickly, protection for MSMEs and SMEs, capital investment as soon as the lockdown is removed, and some income transfers to get revival going, just relief for the economy, and then of course recovery. With that, we wrap up this special edition of Indianomics. Thank you very much for watching, but stay on, there's lots more coming up for you.